All right. Hello, everybody. Okay, so we're beginning our unit on monasticism. The assessment for this is going to be the Illuminated Manuscript Project, which we will start next week. We'll look more into that next week. Yesterday, we watched a clip from the movie Into Great Silence by a German filmmaker. He basically lived for 6 months with the Carthusian monks at the Grande Chartreuse in France, in the Alps. That is the same monastery where Guigo, who wrote the Ladder of Monks, which we've read a few different times for our Friday spiritual conferences, Guigo was the prior, or the second in charge, at the Grande Chartreuse in the 1100s. Okay, so that same monastery, this filmmaker lived there for 6 months and just filmed basically the life of the monks there. So I thought that was an interesting way to introduce monasticism, but we're going to look at the historical development today. So you should have read by now Robert Louis Wilkins, at least a part of his chapter on the development of monasticism. That's a great book if you're ever interested, which none of you probably ever will be, but in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, it's an awesome book. So where did monasticism come from? Well, you've got hermits in the desert. Wilkin talks about people living in solitude or as solitaries, even prior to St. Anthony, which is true. One of the more well-known hermits was Paul of Thebes. A hermit, by the way, is basically the same as a solitary in the early church. Okay, so Paul of Thebes is around this time period, around 250, he flees persecution by the Roman Empire, right, middle of that persecution time period, to go live a solitary life of prayer and penance in the desert. Okay, Edict of Milan, 313. Obviously, we just talked about that with the Arian controversy. It also leads to Christianity getting watered down a little bit. It becomes a little more comfortable to be a Christian, so the church loses some of its moral and spiritual enthusiasm. At the same time, we've got these heresies like Arianism popping up. Okay, so the desert life appeals to the people who want to live Christian life more intensely. It actually comes to be called white martyrdom. So red martyrdom is actual martyrdom, being killed for the faith. But when that's no longer an option, then that same martyr kind of spirituality and attitude gets adopted by people who want to go live in the desert. Okay, so going to the desert becomes a form of martyrdom without dying, because it's not an option to be killed for the faith anymore. Okay, so I'll put that in this presentation as well. But this leads to this group being referred to as the Desert Fathers, which is these early Christian writers and monks who left the world to live lives of prayer and penance in the desert. Okay, Paul of Thebes is one. St. Anthony is kind of the big figure there, and there are a lot of other ones as well. Okay, speaking of St. Anthony, all right, so he's born into a Christian family but loses his parents when he's very young. Well, not very, very young, but relatively young, around 20. And then he hears this part of the gospel proclaimed where Jesus tells the rich man, in fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, if you'd be perfect, go sell all that you have and come follow me. And he feels at the moment like this is Jesus speaking this directly to him. Like this is actually a command to him specifically. So he does that. He sells all of his property. I think Wilkin mentions he kept a little bit to take care of his little sister. But other than that, he moves out into the desert and lives more or less in complete solitude. People will bring him bread once in a while for about 15 years. And then people start coming to him more for spiritual advice and for his help in the prayer life and all of that. And then eventually people start to live as hermits in the caves surrounding him. Okay, so you get a sort of informal organization of monks, but it's not a monastery in the organized way. Okay. He ends up spending his final years in the mountains near the Red Sea. If you remember that guy, Father Lazarus, at the beginning of the year, we watched that BBC Extreme Pilgrim episode where the British guy goes to see Father Lazarus up on the mountain in the desert. Father Lazarus lives in the mountains above the monastery of St. Anthony. And that monastery is built on the spot basically where Antony spent his final years. Okay. And then you see St. Pacomius, is a convert from paganism, actually retires from the Roman army, and then ends up converting and becoming a hermit. He's the first guy to form a really well structured, successful community of monks, living according to a strict rule of life, which is basically giving instructions and rules or precepts for monastic living. But basically outlines every detail of the monk's lives. When do we pray? When do we go to bed? When do we get up? When do we eat? When do we work? What work do we do? All of that stuff is laid out in the rule of life. Okay. Sanitation bell there. So work was a central part of Pacomius's monasteries, and we'll see in Benedictine monasticism, ora et labora, prayer and work is kind of the Benedictine motto. All right. So Pacomius's monasteries were like agricultural colonies. So they were farming communities, basically, structured around a life of prayer and penance. Okay. They provided for their own sustenance, more or less, and sold whatever they didn't need. So he starts 8 monasteries in his lifetime. There's thousands of monks living in these monasteries by the time he dies. Okay. So he's kind of the founder of monasticism as we know it, where there are these organized monastic communities that work to sustain themselves, but are structured around prayer and penance and communal life. Okay. All right. So that's a basic outline of where monasticism comes from. We will talk about St. Benedict, read some of St. Benedict's rule, and then we'll start the illuminated manuscript project soon. All right. We'll be back.